Hello to my viewers. It's been a while since I last made a video, but I just recently played the Genshin Archon quest interlude entitled Paralogism, and I have a few thoughts on it as a pretty huge fan of Albedo. Yes, I actually have a couple of Albedo t-shirts and a sweater, and he appears on my laptop's home screen. I know I said I might not be making any more Genshin-focused videos the last time around, but I found this particular topic to be too juicy to ignore. I will say I'm not sure if I can continue making videos regularly after this, and I can't say whether or not I'll transition to making other kinds of content, but we'll just see where life leads me. What's important right now is breaking down the character arc of Albedo the Cryda Prince. There will be spoilers ahead, so stop watching this video if you haven't played the quest and don't want to get spoiled. Having spent time in the Genshin fandom before, I would come across some Albedo fans that appreciate him for his gentle demeanor, charisma, talent, and a bit of his mysteriousness as well. But I had the sense that many non-Albedo fans had a tendency to view him solely as a vessel of secrets who would eventually become a source of lore bombs in the future. So what that means is there was a lot of fear-mongering about Albedo's future, like would he end up destroying Mondstadt? Would he end up dying somehow? Is it possible that the fake Albedo killed the real Albedo in the Shadows Amid Snowstorms event? Of course, there was reason to be suspicious of Albedo due to him practicing the art of Kemia, his association with Winidaughter, whom we now know as one of the five sinners, and people also cited additional evidence like Venti's voice line about him. Although I always felt like these ideas were a bit far-fetched and resulted from a lack of understanding of Albedo's personal views and character arc, these things people said about him still made me very worried about what would happen in Paralogism based on the trailer. This is why I was sort of nervous getting into the quest as much as I was curious. I was worried that Albedo was indeed guilty of the charges against him, but I told myself, hey, maybe it's finally time to acquire a morally gray favorite. But then I was also worried that maybe this Albedo that we were dealing with since Shadows Amid Snowstorms was not the real one, and even towards the end of the mostly uplifting questline, I was still worried that he would die of some sort of alchemical exertion at the end. Fortunately, none of these things happened, and logically speaking, there were lots of reasons why these wouldn't happen. First is, even if Albedo committed a crime, I doubt he would do it if he didn't think it could potentially be in service of the greater good. Second is, he seemed to have formed a community in Mondstadt already, so it wouldn't make sense for him to harm the city as a whole. And thirdly, I did notice that the Albedo we were interacting with throughout 2022 all the way to 2024 was someone with enough artistry, generosity, and sensitivity that could probably only be achieved by the real Albedo. Nonetheless, as I played the quest, these points of logic were pushed aside in favor of me worrying about certain ominous events coming into fruition. Even as an Albedo fan, my trust was challenged in Paralogism because he seemed suspicious, and I wondered if the other characters' trust in Albedo was also just a setup for an even greater betrayal. But then if you played the quest, you'll learn that Albedo only had Mondstadt's best interests in mind the whole time, and that he still kept his moral principles intact throughout. And this outcome is what made me realize that when it comes to predicting a character's future actions, we should take their personality and growth into account, and that trusting these characters can actually be reasonable rather than naive. I know there's no such thing as truly trusting the characters since they're fictional and are created by writers employed by Hoyoverse, and based on their track record, I wouldn't say they're always the most trustworthy in terms of creating good narratives. I have been disappointed by how overly straightforward the Natlan Archon quest was, with a lack of political tension and moral dilemmas among the characters, instead focusing on fighting the abyss with shonen-style power of friendship. And in world quests, Genshin has often abused the concept of twist villains, with our initial adventure guides often being revealed to be evil at the end. Some recent characters released in Genshin have also tended to have less distinct personalities with fewer complex personal beliefs, so some would believe that Hoyoverse's ability to write characters has well diminished. Even beyond these examples, it's not hard to imagine writers sabotaging their own characters. Like, I haven't watched it, but I have heard that fans of How I Met Your Mother were severely disappointed by the ending because it didn't feel right considering the show's character development. For these reasons, I understand why some fans might be led to believe that pretty much anything can happen narratively, when story writers can sometimes be prone to crafting plot points based on shock value or convenience rather than character development or logic. Because of this, I'm not saying that we literally trust that the writers will write certain characters in such a way that stays true to their arc, but that personality, beliefs, and background can be taken as factors to determine what characters will likely do in the future, rather than basing predictions solely on basic character facts and their affiliations on paper. At least, even if we can't be entirely sure of how Hoyoverse will write their characters' destinies, we can make more educated guesses based on various areas of evidence rather than focusing solely on lore facts alone. Like in Albedo's case, the fact that he's from Conria and the fact that he's a homunculus who performs alchemy can give us insights about the choices he will make in the future. But his own beliefs about his background and his own demeanor will help us better determine how he will engage with these facts about himself. For instance, it would be beneficial for us to understand his philosophy towards the art of creation as an alchemist, since that would be the basis for deciding how or what he should even create. I will admit that his stances on the matter have not been the most clear, since he mostly just references the task Daughter has given to him without actively discoursing on the harmful effects of creating life through alchemy. However, he does share a few of his thoughts in the Shadows Amid Snowstorms event, which was in charge of revealing most of his lore. He acknowledges that creation can be viewed as an arrogant endeavor, and he notes the need for respect and reverence when it comes to approaching the act of creation to ensure that it doesn't go haywire, such as what happened to his quote-unquote siblings. Nonetheless, the phrasing of his statements are open to interpretation because you can see that he's still determined to undertake the act of alchemical creation, as he frames it as a way for beings to shape their own destiny. And even upon reading it multiple times, I can't tell whether or not he's condemning the gods for their arrogant approach to creation and the double standards wherein humans that create life are punished, whereas gods are revered for it. Still, as ambiguous as his statement was, I find it very important to note how he understood the moral dilemmas surrounding creation, which was solidified by the fact that he also lived through its consequences. Like, sure, the fact that he's alive is a testament to the wonders of alchemical creation, but he also has had first-hand experiences with its dire consequences in the form of Durin and Subject 2. So he knows very well that alchemy is a double-edged sword, and I think that logically speaking, this knowledge would be something that informs his character arc. Hence, even if I personally can't foresee exactly how ambitious he would become in terms of creating new life, I could sense that he would likely take ethical considerations into account as much as possible. It's also important to note that he expressed feeling a twinge of guilt upon killing Subject 2, and his narration of the events from Subject 2's perspective shows that Albedo is quite capable of great amounts of empathy, and empathy is something that makes a person less prone to hurting those around them. Another thing to take note of, aside from his beliefs, would be his general demeanor and attitude. In quests where he has appeared after Shadows Amid Snowstorms, he's been depicted as very caring, responsible, and a patient caretaker of Klee. He's also shown to get along well with characters he's met for the first time, as well as his fellow Knights of Favonius. His particular way of interacting with people is that he's both honest and gentle rather than being necessarily full of fake charm, so to me, it decreases the likelihood that he was just putting on a front while preparing to do something maniacal. In Vinelazefest in particular, I noticed how he mentioned that he was starting to see the value in alchemical concoctions created for the benefit of Mondstadt citizens, such as the sobriety potion he made, and I think that marked a slight shift in his approach to alchemy, as he's able to see it as something meant for public benefit rather than scientific progress in and of itself. I also find it worth noting that he's an artist, which isn't always a sign of morality. I mean, come on, look at a certain Austrian painter in the 1930s. But in Albedo's case, I think it's something portrayed as his way of nurturing his humanity to complement his search for scientific advancement. I believe that it's this artistry of his that allows him to seek inspiration and keep in touch with his emotions and surroundings rather than being single-mindedly focused on his pursuit of alchemical feats. My point is that even if I think Genshin was playing up Albedo's suspiciousness to some degree, there were also lots of indicators that he was going to be a good person and do the right thing. Or even if he ended up doing the wrong thing, I think it would have come from very good intentions rather than purely mad scientist sentiments, seeing as Albedo never really talked about creation with a tinge of obsession before. Although yes, he still honored the tradition of the art of chemia, I don't think that fact was enough to establish him as someone who was particularly morally dubious. I know people were citing Venti's line as some sort of potential foreshadowing of how Albedo could lose control of the art of chemia, but I think it's also worth noting that the last line about Mondstadt citizens dealing with the problem themselves is something that could be read as an expression of trust. I know it's commonly read as Venti being a bit too carefree or willingly deluding himself in order to turn a blind eye to these issues, but in hindsight, I think this was more of an expression of trust that Mondstadt citizens could handle their issues well, and this trust may have likely extended to Albedo, and we now know that to be true based on the events of Paralogism. Admittedly, I think one small red herring that really captured the fandom's imagination was the fact that Albedo's star mark on his neck briefly disappeared at the end of Shadows Amid Snowstorms. Many thought it could be a sign that Subject 2 replaced Albedo, or me personally, I was guessing that Albedo might have been briefly corrupted by Subject 2 or by the art of chemia, so there's this potential for him to go crazy for a short amount of time. When he did appear in the Irodori festival, however, his behavior made me confident that the one we were talking to was the real Albedo, but I was still worried that Subject 2 was still out there or that Albedo, Subject 1, had the potential to go a bit nuts for a moment. However, this thing was passed off as a joke in the quest, and by the time Paralogism came, this wasn't acknowledged, so I guess it really was just a joke. In hindsight though, I think the point of this temporary star mark removal was perhaps a way to show that Albedo could in theory present himself as being closer to humanity by shedding his identifier as a homunculus, but by keeping it on, he's willing to embrace his imperfections and acknowledge his origins. I think this scene maybe also hints at the fact that physical identifiers are not as reliable as opposed to understanding someone's character traits, because even these physical identifiers can change. Perhaps it may have also been a sign that Albedo's alchemy was improving for him to modify a small part of his physical appearance. Anyway, I do wish that scene was explained better, and I understand why people would latch onto that scene for numerous speculations, but I still assert that fans should not have ignored other pieces of evidence solely to prioritize theorizing based on a single scene alone, while ignoring other pieces of dialogue and general character traits. This is not to say that I could have predicted Albedo's destiny perfectly as a character analyst. I didn't know that he would end up creating a humanoid creature on his own, even though retrospectively this does suit his character art quite perfectly. However, I think that getting to know Albedo's personality had allowed me to trust him a bit more throughout 2022 to 2024, and it allowed me to rule out some predictions such as that Subject 2 had replaced him, or that he would turn into a mad scientist in such a way that would have a particularly destructive impact on Mondstadt. Based on Albedo's character arc in Paralogism, I think my learnings from this quest can also be applied to other characters who seem suspicious but have also given us enough reason to believe in their general kindness. There are lots of examples of those characters in Mondstadt, particularly Kaya and Venti, who have always been perceived as potential traitors alongside Albedo. People latch onto the fact that they're keeping secrets or that they have secret identities without considering the greater context. Kinda like people fixating on the fact that Kaya's lineage traces back to Clothar Alberic, the founder of the Abyss Order, without considering how disturbed he felt by this revelation. That's because fans assume that if you're keeping a secret from someone, it must mean you're plotting against them, not considering that secrecy can also be a way of protecting one's vulnerability. I'm glad that the Paralogism quest itself recognized that it was important to keep Albedo's identity as a homunculus a secret, because this could turn into a point of discrimination against him by Mondstatters. They recognize that upon learning his true identity, people will view it as something that defines him entirely, and they understand that supporting a friend means allowing them to define themselves based on their own terms. Unfortunately, the fans have the exact same mentality that the Traveler and Albedo were trying to guard against, so I think it would be a good exercise to look beyond character origins alone and imagine ways for characters to forge their own destiny, which actually always has been the theme of Genshin anyway. That's why I think when we figure out that a certain new character has a unique background in terms of being non-human or in terms of possible affiliations with Conria, we should consider the question of who are they really? It's a question that launches an inquiry into their secret identities and powers while also providing room for reflection on how they take up space in the world and fulfill multiple roles. I remember making a video on Novelette that explored his identity as the Dragon Sovereign of Water, while also talking about his attitudes towards justice and his great empathy for humankind, all of which factor into his overall personality. It's also important to consider a character's track record of things they've done in the past, because this provides more information on their destiny compared to simply looking at their background. So with the example of, let's say, Kaya, the multiple times he has provided assistance to Mondstatters in terms of moral and logistical support are more concrete compared to the vague prospect of him potentially betraying the nation. Although I do understand that traitors tend to build their credibility first, he's a character who has had honest reflections about his community and his desire to define his own path, as exemplified by his story quest route, where he had to take part in a play where he played a character that was coincidentally very similar to him. And he has found joy and acceptance in his community, so I think the chances of him betraying Mondstadt are quite low compared to how the fandom makes it out to be. For another suspicious character like Venti, while it is clear that he has been hiding some secrets from the Traveler, he has constantly protected Mondstadt, so I foresee that even if, let's say, he were to betray the Traveler, it would probably be done for the sake of Mondstadt's well-being, which is something rather admirable. Not to say all suspicious characters are innocent or that they're always in the right, but that it's important to understand the context of certain characters' secrecy and to examine their interactions with their community for clues on how they might act in the future. I do understand that part of why Genshin fans tend to be suspicious of certain characters or make wild lore theories isn't only because they're ignoring characters' personality traits, but I think it's also born out of their desire for more exciting storylines from the game. I know that many people hold the view that Genshin storylines tend to play safe, with its reluctance to kill off playable characters and its habit of always providing redeeming qualities to evil characters without making good characters seem more morally dubious. I actually do kinda like these things about the game, but I understand why many fans wouldn't. Sometimes it seems like a cop-out from writers who are too cowardly to push the boundary of storytelling. However, while I do respect dark and somewhat edgy storytelling, it doesn't exactly suit the theme of Genshin Impact's overall storyline, which discusses the power of hope and the power to change one's destiny. As long as the payoff is well earned, then a hopeful destiny for certain characters can be the most sensible conclusion, such as it is with Albedo's character arc. I do think that if Albedo murdered to create life, or if he was defeated by Subject 2, then on the surface it would seem like boundary-pushing storytelling, but then it would undercut his character growth for shock value. Instead, I think the outcome of the Paralogism quest helps answer some of the questions Albedo posed about the act of creation in Shadows Amid Snowstorms. He was able to find a purpose for creation which was rooted in salvation rather than hubris, and he was also able to find a purpose for his own existence in the process. He not only was able to reach the pinnacle of alchemical prowess, but at the same time, he also discovered what it meant to truly get a life, as he put it, hinting that living goes beyond the mere state of being alive, in that it involves making important decisions, fulfilling personal goals, and building community. That's why even though I didn't predict the exact course of events of Paralogism, and I didn't really expect him to create a new humanoid creature, Looking back on his journey, this conclusion really does suit him very well. So even though Paralogism didn't stray from Genshin's pattern of creating hopeful storylines, it was able to push boundaries within Teyvat lore by allowing us to encounter someone who could create new life aside from Daughter, using methods that were both similar and maybe slightly different from hers. I'm saying different because Albedo derived this new being's consciousness from Mini Durin rather than creating it from scratch. At least that's how I remember it. In a sense, I think Albedo's storyline is still thought-provoking and provides some little form of moral ambiguity despite the fact that Paralogism mostly demonstrated Albedo's moral righteousness. I consider it a bit morally ambiguous in that it challenges the previously held notion in the game that attempting creation through the art of Kemia is an arrogant act which could potentially harm society. The fact that Venti also seemed to approve of this plan shows his potential defiance of Celestia's laws. And at the same time, by engaging in this act of creation, Albedo now gets compared more closely to his own creator Daughter, who is one of the 5 sinners. So this emphasizes the question of what is it that gave these 5 people the brand of sinners, and were they really wrong the entire time? Maybe context and intention are important in figuring out the distinction between right or wrong, and people on both sides could potentially share similar methods of achieving their goals. Albedo's own morality also speaks to the complexity of Daughter's character, showing that her own endeavors in pursuing alchemy have both extremely negative and extremely positive consequences. In a sense, Albedo himself, while an individual on his own, could be considered as her redemption and the redemption of the art of Kemia as a whole. Hence, the game's portrayal of alchemy seems to be getting more well-rounded and complex as we move forward, and it provides for many interesting philosophical explorations as opposed to if we were just to cast it aside as something entirely harmful. So yes, I understand that Genshin fans might want more stakes and some darker elements to the storytelling they're consuming, but I hope we can open our minds a bit more to the ways in which hopeful and redemptive storylines can also be thought-provoking and complex given the right setup. Overall, as a fan of Albedo, I just really appreciated the quest as a whole, and while I like to think I understood Albedo quite well already, Paralogism also gave me a renewed understanding of his character with new context, which allowed me to cherish his character even more. What I thought would be an ominous lore bomb quest turned into something oddly heartwarming for me and fellow Albedo fans, and I hope that other characters will have satisfying conclusions to their own stories as well. I say conclusion because although I'm sure Albedo has a long future ahead, the setup of his character arc based on his story quest and Shadows Amid Snowstorms seems to have wrapped up quite well, and his future involvement in Genshin's storyline would probably be more of his external involvement in Mondstadt's affairs, with his internal dilemmas being mostly settled already. I'm looking forward to see how Durin's human form turns out, and whether this attempt turned out to be truly successful or not. At least, we know that Albedo went to it with only the best intentions in mind. I hope to see how his developed character might play off of Daughters in the future, so we can see where their values align and diverge, and how they will settle this. I'm also looking forward to see how Albedo will continue to serve Mondstadt in this capacity as the story progresses. It'll definitely be interesting to see, especially now that the foundations of Albedo's character have been more concretely established through Paralogism, which is fortunately a permanently available quest. This is truly the best gift to Albedo fans who have been anxiously awaiting their favorite character's fate for 3.5 years. What about you guys? What did you think of the quest? What do you expect from Albedo, Mondstadt, and the Hexen Circle in the future? Let me know by commenting below, and if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you shared it with your fellow Albedo fans so that they may also find an avenue to process their thoughts on this wonderful quest. Thank you so much for watching.